Hello, I'm Sarah Jane Mee, standing in for Neil Patterson on the Sky News Daily. Now, before I go on, I want to say that this episode is about child sex offenders. Some of you will find the details upsetting. If this topic isn't for you, scroll back and take a listen to one of our many other podcasts. More than 10,000 people a year are caught either watching, looking at, or sharing indecent images of children. That figure is on the rise, and the majority of those are men who are living with partners and children. After an arrest and a conviction, the offenders are given psychological support and counselling. But what happens to their families?
It was a really normal day. I'd just given my children their tea and the door knocked and a policeman was standing there, and he was in plain clothes, and he looked at me straight in the eye and said, "I'm sorry, life is never going to be the same again. The next few months are going to be hell and there's nothing you can do to avoid it."
This is Heather, not her real name. We're protecting her identity.
And then told me what the search warrant meant that he had in his hand. And that point said that they were going to be taking all the electronic storage devices within my home to look to see whether or not there was any indecent images on there.
Heather, that's quite something to be confronted with on your doorstep. How did that feel?
I was in complete shock. I genuinely never thought that my ex-husband would ever have any interest in underage children. There was no signs whatsoever as far as I was concerned. So I completely trust the police. So I let them in and they searched every part of my home. And then a lady officer basically stood with me in the kitchen, and most of the evening was a blur, but there are certain points that I can remember with the intensity of a flashback. Her description of an A, B, and C image that my ex-husband, they suspected my ex-husband had accessed all three. She told me that it's really important that I keep everything confidential because of the how stigmatized this crime is. And my home may be spray painted, I may be verbally accosted in the street. It's just so hard, and that children's services were going to come out and interview my children to see if they'd been physically abused themselves, directly abused, and I just couldn't make sense of what she was telling me.
This is all unfolding in the space of a few minutes, a few hours from that knock on the door. I mean, that's so much for you to compute, Heather. You've been caught totally off guard by all of this. What was the next 24 hours like?
Really just overwhelming, really. He was released on bail, so to an alternative address. As I said, it was really, police said, don't tell friends, family. Once this information gets out there, there's no bringing it back in. It would affect his suicide risk because of how ashamed he felt. But I think it was the following week for me that it really started feeling real, really real. Children's services came out. It's the only time they ever came out. And they were even more scary than the police about confidentiality. They said, if it were to get out, my children may be excluded from class parties. Other mums at the school gate may worry that their children hadn't been safe in my care during historical play dates. It just felt like I hadn't done anything. I didn't know he was doing anything in my own home, my safe space, and suddenly I'm going to be judged, and it's very, very scary.
Heather, that's such a lot to bear on your shoulders, because you're being told not to tell friends and family, who are the first people you turn to in times of a crisis, and this is a crisis. Where could you turn? Where could you get support from?
This is the real problem with this crime, is the fact that there is no support for us. The police can't tell you anything due to suspects' right to privacy, so they have very, very little to do with families. We're not witnesses, we're not victims. we're not victims in the victims code anyway, so they don't stay in contact with us. Children's Services signed us off as a family within 2 weeks. We were never given a social worker. I was deemed good enough protective factor, thankfully, and they recommended supervised access only. So even though my relationship with him had ended, he was still my children's father. So, they were just going to, he lived round the corner. How could I explain that they couldn't see him anymore and we bump into him in Asda, So Children's Services didn't help me at all because they signed us off, and it was kind of like, well, there you go, crack on, get on with supervised access. And the practical, emotional and psychological ramifications of supervised only access is just so hard. I don't think agencies realise how much that impacts family life. And
Heather, you've had no professional guidance on how to talk to your children about this, because what's been the impact on them? Offenders get support, they get psychological support, but as you said, you're not a victim, you're not a witness, you fall through the gap, you don't get anything. How have the children coped? Because that's been up to you.
Yeah, it's been really, really difficult. I mean, I think they would have benefited from therapeutic play therapy earlier. I've had to fight really hard to get it. I was advised by the police that I could get some support through victim support, but because we're not defined as victims in victims code, they didn't have the funding. And then victim support advised me to go to a child sexual abuse charity. And that's another sort of flashback moment, because I can remember the lady on the phone there. She was really kind, but she was like, I'm really sorry. Your children are not victims in the victims code. So we've barely got enough funding to support the directly abused children. And, so it was, I can remember her saying as kindly as she could, just be grateful you don't fit our criteria. So I can remember sort of walking away going that there's no one to help me, and I've just got to support these children the best I can. And it was just heartbreaking.
Heather, you now advocate for change for families like yours. What you said there, that kind woman you spoke to on the phone who you were asking for support, said your children aren't victims. What you've gone through, psychologists have said, is equivalent to PTSD in a war zone. So when you hear that your children and you are not victims, what do you want to say in response to that?
Main thing is I have felt a number of times on this journey that it's like me and my children aren't quite damaged enough to merit any support. And everything for those kids has changed in an instant. It was an unexpected, life-changing event that has shaped their childhood. And we do need help to get through it. Their dad hasn't been able to share any milestone events. Their understanding around his offence has evolved as they've got older. It's impacted every area of my life, and I just fear, I think they're doing okay now, bless them, because they're awesome. But
and they sound like they've got a great mum, Heather.
Oh, thank you very much. But yeah, they're awesome little kids. So well, not so little anymore, are they? But yeah, I just think it is going to affect them as they get older.
After the break, we're going to be speaking to our correspondent, Katerina Vittozzi. She spent time with the paedophile online investigation team at Lincolnshire Police, looking at what they're doing to support families. I'm joined now by our correspondent, Katerina Vittozzi, who's been following this story for months. Katerina, that was a really upsetting story we just heard there from Heather. How many others are like this?
I think it would be so easy, wouldn't it, to assume that it's something which doesn't happen to people very often. It doesn't happen to people we know. But I think it's only has that perception because people don't really talk about it. The families affected don't talk about it because of the stigma and the shame that Heather's talked about, and families that we've spoken talk about sort of transferring to them as a result of their partner, husband, son, brother, dad offending and committing an offence which involves children in this way. But we know that around 10,000 British families now every year will find out that a relative is guilty or suspected of online child sex offences, so viewing indecent images of children. And a lot of research is now going in to look at who are these people committing these crimes or who are suspected of committing these crimes. And typically they're men, and the majority we know have partners and children living with them at the time of the offence. So if you think, okay, that's 10,000 offenders, then how many children will be affected? It's tens of thousands every year in England and Wales.
And why are the numbers going up, Katerina? Is there any clarity on that?
Well, there isn't really a clear steer of why they're going up, but the police forces can pinpoint very precisely when the numbers did go up, and it was during COVID, during the lockdown. And they say from the people that they interview, it really is time spent in front of a computer or in front of a device. Whereas previously, before COVID, it may have been that people were at work and it was harder to access and look online for these sorts of images. When people were at home, it was just simply a case of it being much more readily available. But what police forces haven't seen is then the trend going down. You know, we contacted every police force across England and Wales as part of this report. And so many got back in touch with us to say that their online paedophile investigation teams are now the busiest teams on the entire force. They have more active investigations than any other department. And people are seeing and perceiving this, campaigners, people that want greater support for the families, they say it's like seeing a crisis unfolding in slow motion. All they can see are the numbers of offenders rising, and therefore the numbers of families who find out that they are now embroiled in this world of which they had no clue and no knowledge, the numbers of families and children going up as well.
And once those offenders are caught, a new story starts, and that is the story for the offenders' families, because this has such a devastating impact on their lives. And we got a snapshot of it there from Heather. But you've been speaking to other families. What have they been saying to you about what life is like after that knock on the door comes? It's
extraordinary, isn't it, to think that it is literally a case of as soon as that knock on the door takes place, your life is totally turned upside down. You've spoken to Heather, we've spoken to lots of families. I've sat down and had a long conversation with a woman called Sarah. She's a working mum in her late 40s, 2 kids, was fast asleep, the doorbell goes, and it's the police at the door. Her husband answers it, comes back into the bedroom and just says, "I've been arrested." And she's like, half asleep, asks him what for. And he just says the word images. And from that moment, their entire life changes. Officers that we've spoken to, police officers and families, tell us that there is still this underlying suspicion of, well, how could you not know that your partner was doing this? How could you be sitting on a sofa with him, as it generally is, the man, sitting at home with him on his phone, accessing images? How could you not know that that was happening under your roof? The vast, vast majority of time, people don't have a clue. The first time they find out is when there is that knock on the door and there's a police officer in their house, multiple police officers who are searching every single room and sit them down and say, "This is what we believe your partner has been doing." And from that moment, their lives are utterly changed.
And you've been spending time with Lincolnshire Police paedophile online investigation team. What are they saying to you about how they, as a force, deal with the families? The offenders is one thing, but the families is a completely separate thing to deal with.
One officer we spoke to, called DC Gemma Oxby, basically said they would feel like, as a team, they would go in, lob a grenade into the front room, leave a couple of leaflets at best, and then leave. And she said, we couldn't ignore the impact we were having on families. She was telling us, this is a role that's about safeguarding children. That doesn't mean we pick and choose which children we safeguard. Yes, of course, we're looking out and our job is to police and investigate the children in the images themselves, but you can't then ignore the safeguarding risk that we've created for the children and the families that we have gone in and turned their lives upside down. And they said it was having an impact, they felt, not only on the families, but also on the officers themselves. They said we were having officers who were finding it incredibly traumatic. We had issues of burnout, officers who simply weren't able to carry on doing this sort of job, feeling like there wasn't support for the families that they were leaving behind. So what Lincolnshire Police have done, which is unique to any police force of England and Wales, is that they now have a dedicated police officer who will provide one-on-one support for these families. So there may be a police raid in the morning, the investigating team do what they have to do, they will leave the home, and then an officer will call and support that family through the process. And it can be the questions that the officer we spoke to, PC Tom Scott, said people ask him, it can be, can my partner come home tonight? Will he come home tonight? Will there be bail conditions? Can he be alone with our children? Or it could be as simple as, what happens now with my work? Do I have to tell them? What do I tell the schools? What do I even tell my own family? It was as stark as the officer telling us that he had been told by families he was supporting. They said, if your role wasn't here, we wouldn't be here now.
It's incredible, isn't it? Just one role, one officer making such a huge difference. Are there plans to take this
really
nationwide or roll it out, Katerina?
Well, simply put, no, because there's no mandatory need for police forces to do this. There's nothing that says they have to. There's guidance from the National Police Chiefs Council. But it's not mandatory, they don't have to. If a police force feels within its budget it can't, support a role like this, then they can't support a role like this. And we spoke to the Ministry of Justice to ask if there might be any changes to the victims code, but that's the definition of who is a victim, and they simply said, at the moment, no. They said there's enough support within the charitable sector to support these families, and that is really where the conversation stops. There are members of Parliament who are trying to drive change and trying to really push for children in particular of paedophiles and those convicted of online child sex offences to qualify as indirect victims, which would mean they are able to access a bit more support. But it's a hard fight. But quite simply, the numbers are now so compelling, they're growing so much. Lincolnshire Police Force say we simply need to catch up.
Let's just hear one last thing from Heather on what hope she has for other families like hers.
Whether you stay with the offender to stay together as a family unit, or whether you move forward separately and still have supervised access or have none at all like I have now, the ramifications still keep building on. Primarily, I think it's really important that there is a single point of contact from the day one, from the knock, that we can go to for advice on how to adhere to any legal requirements around access. I think it's vital that families are told directly when the court date is going to happen. So I think what we need is better communication between agencies and the remaining safeguarding parent, because we're doing this alone. To have some sort of advocacy service that when things feel overwhelming, when, starting to get panic attacks every time someone knocks the door, or waking up in the middle of the night with your heart pounding out your chest because you think your children aren't safe in their own beds, you've got someone to say, I'm really starting to struggle now. Someone to speak to the schools with you so that your children get empathy and support in schools in the same way that children are impacted by domestic violence have. So I think there's some really clear things that could be done. We know this is going to be a trauma event. Say we. The police know this is going to be a trauma event before they knock on the door. It's a planned trauma. You don't get that very often in life. So I think there is a duty of care to my children, that there is a safety net built around them, because they are more vulnerable as a direct response of this crime. So the harm occurs after the knock to families, because before the knock we are a normal family, and after the knock we are a family living with a low risk of child sexual abuse.
If you've been affected by anything you've heard on this episode, you can call the Samaritans for help, 116 123. I'm Sarah Jane Mee. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Sky News Daily. Neil Patterson is back tomorrow.